Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see so many people here for this special occasion. I'm William Andrews, Director of Ogden Museum, and I welcome you on behalf of our staff and trustees to another great opportunity to explore the exhibition Solidary and Solitary. I have a lot of people to thank. We'll be brief because we want to get to hearing the thoughts of the artists and curators here soon, but firstly, I want to thank the Helis Foundation, our presenting sponsors for Solidary and Solitary. It's an incredible opportunity to bring something to the community of New Orleans and also to travel it beyond there to 6 other institutions. So this is an engaging new narrative that is going to travel, and we know that it will spread. So thank you, Helis Foundation. I know that Jesse Haynes is here, Managing Director of Helis Foundation. It's a unique foundation in that they are primarily and solely concerned with funding of arts and culture initiatives in New Orleans. And that's such a rare and unusual beast to have someone who's willing to step up and shine the light on the path and the way for people to really get to experience some unusual and extraordinary circumstances here. We're very appreciative. Also for the Lambent Foundation, who took an early lead in providing for this project. We're very thankful also to the Holt Family Foundation, all of whom have made this possible. And Hearst WDSU did a really great thing for us. They did a documentary on Pamela and the collection and Fred, and gave us some exposition that we wouldn't normally have. And it's been, you know, it's one of those things where you didn't imagine if how well television and art collections mix, but it did well, and we keep having people come in all the time saying they saw it first that way. So I think it's really exciting development. I definitely want to thank Pamela and Fred, who are here today. Thank you so much for sharing your collection with us. You can imagine when curators walk into your home and look at your prized collection that you care so much about and have spent decades creating and investing in, and the scholarship and the connoisseurship and the understanding and the absolute passion, and the curators say, "Can we borrow this for 2 years?" It's a wonderful commitment, and we are very, very grateful. I want to thank curators of the exhibition, Chris Bedford and Katy Siegel, for their scholarship, which has been stunning. And certainly illuminating, because it's one of those rare opportunities as a museum administrator when curators come to you after about a year of working on the narrative of a project and they say, "We've completely changed our mind about how this should be presented." But what they have done is so truly illuminating with the work of these artists spanning 4 generations that it makes it a revelatory experience, one room after another. It's speaking volumes, not just about the work itself and its material surface and its process, but also the artists who made it and their interconnectivity and their place in this history that we're talking about. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, by the way, members of Ogden Museum, our traveling friends from Baltimore and San Antonio, and all who have come here for Prospect 4 this weekend, are very good partners there. I think you're going to see a really incredible opportunity of magnetism here this weekend, so we're proud to be part of that. I do get the great opportunity to introduce Chris Bedford again, and I've been able to polish it now because I think it's the 3rd time in 3 days. Most of you all know Chris. This was such incredible synergy when Chris and Katy became engaged with the project to have them, because obviously they were the curators for the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale presenting the work of Mark Bradford, who is also in this collection. So we got an immediate boost to the international stage with recognition and profile for the collection, and it's fantastic. Chris is the director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, where Katy is also a senior curator. He was formerly at the Rose Museum at Brandeis University, the Wexner and LACMA, and I think everyone knows his work very well. Chris, I'm indebted to you and our partnership at the Baltimore Museum of Art. When we became co-organizers of this project as it grew, it was a relief not only to have partners carrying this great monumental opportunity for scholarship and movement, but also to know Chris better and to work with Katy and to, through them, get to know these artists better. And that's who I want to thank the last and the most, is the artists in the collection who are sharing your time with us today. It's the artists and their work which we are celebrating today. and the collectors who have allowed us to share that with them. Thank you so much, and please enjoy.
So thank you, William, for the typically gracious introduction. And you are well practiced. 3rd time in 2 days, pitch perfection. Thank you. I notice I'm sitting here alongside the work of Mark Bradford, so we're never without the presence of that gargantuan man and his gargantuan sculpture. And it's quite a way to enter a museum and to announce the ambition of an exhibition. I think it's perfectly appropriate as a context for this discussion. So before we launch into the substance of the afternoon, I wanted to just take a moment to thank a few people. Some of it's reiterative, but I think the magnitude of this project warrants some reiteration, so I'm going to go ahead and take a couple of minutes for it. So first of all, I did want to recognize the Helis Foundation and David Kirstein and Jesse Haynes. I know Jesse is here. And specifically, before we give them a tremendous round of applause, I want to say that this project, although it's grown leaps and bounds in the time it's been gestating, was initially intended to be a small-scale presentation at the Ogden Museum. It now has 7, and it could have, 27 venues as a consequence of public interest in this area. So, but the Helis Foundation advocated for the show very early on, having faith in the idea and in Pamela's collection and in the impact it could have on the city of New Orleans. So for their early investment in this, way before the art world turned its attention towards it, I think they're deserving of a huge round of applause. And then slightly more briefly, the Hearst Foundation, the Hearst and WDSU for producing that wonderful documentary that does seem to drive
That's the level right there, so I'm pulling it up.
towards this exhibition. And I think that's a word we're going to return to in the context of this discussion, making the work we do within the art world more mainstream and accessible. The Holt family foundation, who I think are represented here today, early advocacy for the show as well as the Lambert Foundation, who supported both this and the Venice Biennale and Mark Bradford's work there. So we're indebted to all of those foundations for their early support. I also want to acknowledge the Ogden board, who are represented here, and specifically Alison Kendrick, their board chair, who has been an incredible booster of this show and very generous in hosting the BMA Board of Trustees, many of whom have made the trip to see this exhibition and enjoy Prospect 4. So thank you all so much for coming. And then last but and sincerely not least, the Ogden staff for pulling off this show. So I may be slightly biased in saying this, but I'll go on the record. I think a combination of John Comfort's truly astonishing 3-channel installation here and Solidary Solitary makes this one of the highlights of Prospect 4. And I'm really proud of the Ogden as an institution for undertaking it. It's a big show. It now has many venues, and this is a small staff that's outstripped themselves. So William Andrews, the director, Sari Story, the deputy director, and Wyatt S. Steves, who's lurking somewhere, who was the long-suffering curatorial assistant that had to deal with Katy and I, and our various and sundry switches throughout the course of this show. So they deserve an enormous round of applause. Okay, so I'm going to talk as little as I can from now on, and instead try to ask a couple of leading questions and ignite my panelists. So I'm not going to introduce them too much because they're all well known. Charles Gaines, Leonardo Drew, Shinique Smith, Katy Siegel, and Mel Edwards, a man of great stature who's sitting on a smaller chair. So I think it's important to acknowledge why we're here today, and we're here today as a consequence of a collector and a patron, Pamela Joyner and Fred Giuffrida, and their advocacy for the work that we do as curators and directors and the work that you guys do as artists. And decades ago now, they made a commitment to start collecting within a very narrow range. So African American abstraction, 1945, roughly to the present, beginning with Norman Lewis and all the way through to paint still drying. So I think when they began that enterprise, it was truly speculative. The tide had not turned and public attention wasn't quite so bright on this area of inquiry. So now fast forward 20, 30 years, and the world is paying attention to the work that you were doing. That wasn't the case early on. So I think I want to begin by talking about this concept of patronage. I think that term is often associated with, the Medici and the Italian Renaissance. But actually, patronage and support is incredibly important to the ascendance of artists today. And Pamela and Fred have not just bought work for their own personal collections, they've advocated for institutions to collect your work and to institutionalize this work as part of a broader history. So I would just open it up for comment from all of you on the importance of that gesture relative to your ascendance as artists. Who's going to go first?
Am I on?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, interesting to sort of realize that, like my former teacher and mentor, Jack Whitten, who's at this moment, experiencing this kind of a, I wouldn't even say a resurgence, but it's actually, he's with us, it's like, and I think it has everything to do with people like, Pamela, and actually, I would even say Pamela in particular, Pamela and Fred, and their commitment to bringing this, a black abstraction to the forefront. And when I think about the types of work that they collect and continue to collect, it always sort of rings to a level of intensity and truth when it comes to who we are, the varied ways that we, create art, and when it comes down to, how, or whether we are, political animals when we actually create, it seems to be summed up in so many different varied ways by way of, if you see this collection, you will know that we, we are not this sort of one-note realization of making art. And it's part of a fantastic continuum, and as we sort of push forward, we would like to see more of this, more Pams, more Freds, collecting and bringing to the forefront, not only, artists of color, but women, all these things that actually have to be sort of addressed and, and reanalyzed when it comes to the making of art.
Sure. It's a free-for-all.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
I'd say I'd second all of that, what you just said, Leo, for sure. One of the things that I think is unique about Pamela and Fred as collectors and their patronage, or that type of patronage, is the fact not only that they support Black abstraction and buy it, but also their museum involvement is really important to have a broad-reaching, a more holistic approach to their relationship as well with artists. They have a residency that they invite us to come and make work. So they're involved in the creative aspect too, and that's unique. That's all I have to say. Thanks for that.
Mel can speak more effectively on this, but if you go back a few years, I started exhibiting in the 70s, even though it doesn't look like it. And at the time, there were very few people who had a very specific investment in supporting the practices of Black artists. I mean, there was a similar problem with women artists too at the time, but there weren't. Then the few collectors who were caught in a binary, the few collectors that there were in those days were caught in a binary that trapped abstract art, but done by Black artists, which has to do with the issue of identity, being able to maintain an idea of Blackness through abstraction. And there was a general feeling that you had to do representational work, and so when there was support, it went toward representational work. But even that was dismal. I mean, because Black artists simply weren't exhibited in those days, and I think support by collectors, it's very important now, but it was important then. The lack of that support meant that your work didn't have a voice that entered general conversation with curators and and museum directors and galleries for that matter, that it didn't have really that very important element of pushing the work into the general conversation. And so this helped make it easy at the time to ignore the work of black artists. It's clear to me that Pam and Fred and the work that they've done has made a huge difference. As I was saying, that if you count the years from 1955 or 60 all the way to 1980, I saw more exhibitions in New York during a 2-month period in the last year that represented black artists than I've seen in those 20 years in New York. And I think that it's those two. I mean, it's that first step is really important to show that there's a strong interest in this voice. So I think that support is crucial.
So before we hear a little bit from Mel, I realize in asking you this question, Charles, I've asked it you once before and quite recently, but I thought the answer was so fascinating I wanted to share it with this audience. So you pointed to the fact that during those early years, particularly during the 70s, there was a real dearth of interest in the work you were doing. And I wonder if you could talk about, aside from the present moment, where I think you've described more than adequately sea change in public interest in the work that black artists of all stripes are producing. When did that tide turn for you and why? When did you begin to feel a surge of even modest interest from collectors and institutions?
Yeah, well, for me, I don't know, like yesterday, but in general, that interest, or at least it began to open up in the early '80s, and I think that I've written that one of the great enemies of diversity is the ideology of modernism. I mean, I don't want to trash modernism and kind of a round of applause over there.
Rounds of applause, it's fine. It really animates the whole concept.
I don't. So it's not a wholesale trashing of modernism because there's some aspects of critical inquiry that is very important that it championed. But the problem is that it militated against diversity. So there was always this idea that there was this universal articulation that all artists sought that couldn't be sustained if there was a cultural context to that articulation. And so in the early 80s, there was, I think that representation had, people began to pay attention to representation, which means that they began to pay attention to the context of the work's production, and also how that work spoke to that context. And I think that change was, helped along by Douglas Crimp, and his investigation wasn't interested so much in black artists, but it did have a strong interest in women artists, and through that it opened up a kind of interest in art actually being an activity of cultural production. Rather than being transcending culture and being a sort of elitist activity, and I think that because it opened up, people began to be interested in content a little bit more. I think that at the same time, interest in representation led into an interest in identity and the relationship to art, and I think that at least opened the doors. It's not to say that the doors flew open and we entered a post-black experience from that point on. There was still a lot of problems going on with stereotyping the work of even those artists, Fred Wilson and Lorna Simpson. But I think that's the point where I saw a change. I guess that's it.
So Mel, thank you for being here with us. So I'm going to ask you to reflect on my original question, but also you have the capacity to rewind a little further than some of the rest of us to the 60s in particular. And I wonder whether you have a comment on collecting and patronage and its relationship to your experience as an artist during those years, because I know, having bought work of yours for the Rose Art Museum for the BMA, and looking at some of the lynch fragments upstairs that you were making work then that you're still making now, and I wonder how different the experience feels.
Well, I work in relation to that work in steel. They were making steel in 1963, so I was using it. And I say that rather factually because steel, paper, and plastic are probably the most common materials that human beings use in the world. You know, I guess you could add 2 or 3 other things at this point. And of course, we live in an era that's cyber, and I'm not much of it, except, you know, I asked family to help me with my cell phone. But in 1963, or that period, which was the first moment that I broke through in my work with the lynch fragments. And I say broke through because my school days were primarily as a painter, and I was still painting in the that first period, and had made significant changes and developments within the work. And one of the things that I came to was the distinction between real and abstract were unnecessary because you can't, only time you can make art that's real is really if you make a baby. You follow? In other words, you're really making art all the time. Art is not human, it's not creative at that level. You follow? So, and in order to make art, as in order to make a child, you have to conceive it first. You know. Now, the distinction for me, or distinctions in that, would be similar to if you consider a composer like Charlie Parker, Ornette Coleman, or Anton Webern, Beethoven, or you know, wherever you want to go with that. But the notion that you develop a theme and then you develop variations on it within the context of that work. And when you do that, you then have something else which you then can take the same attitude toward and develop it another stage further. And that was my approach and still is. So when somebody says you're still doing the same thing in the lynch fragments, on the one hand, same or similar is better because it's not the same. I do have chosen that scale of work. I have chosen the collective title of the lynch fragments, but that's a metaphorical title. The individual works themselves have individual titles. And the reason they have individual titles is they're experiments that are individually different from each other. Again, a comparison I would make, and it's probably because of my, you could say the experience of my age group. When I listened to music in 1945, and I was 8 years old, and World War II was ending, and I lived in Dayton, Ohio, compared to Houston, where I was born. Music was 3 minutes long on vinyl records. Incredible compositions were created within 3 minutes. Some of them were highly composed, others were composed by methods of improvisation, you know, but they were both appropriate methods. And the only difference in large-scale orchestra work and a small, short composition, at least for me to draw on, was that one, you have to take the time, write it down, present it to a group of, say, 60 musicians at different instruments, and it just takes that amount of time to get the music together and then present it to people. And improvisation, the time from thought to execution is almost instantaneous. So I understood very early that There's a whole range of approaches possible if you understand things that way. And I understood that sculpture was different than painting because it was absolutely three-dimensional, you know, and that it could take up space. Consequently, in my work, there are pieces that are work that's suspended. In those days, we didn't have the term site-specific. We tended to use the term environmental, and that meant the whole three-dimensional range of a gallery or museum kind of room, you know. So a work could be on the floor, could be on the wall, could be on the ceiling, could combine all of those things. So when I developed the Lynch fragments, which hang on the wall at my own personal eye level, 69 inches from the floor, and separated by 36 inches, which is my arm span. In other words, I was perfect like the Leonardo da Vinci drawing. It used to be perfect. But what I'm getting at is conceptually, that model was something I could use. Now, I'm not, the work is experimental, so it goes a lot of different ways. And for me, the working small gave me ways to experiment with a lot of ideas. And often those small works have inside of them ideas that are developed into large-scale public things, which are pretty much totally geometric. And most people wouldn't understand that because they don't imitate one from the other, but move conceptually in my head from one to the other. In relation to the collectors and their support, there was none. There was none. The person most known for collecting or having my work from that period would be Dr. Leon Banks in Los Angeles. And Dr. Banks took care of everybody's baby. In other words, he was a pediatrician and he took care of all of our children, my 3 daughters, and I got Infamil, they got shots, diagnosed for a hernia, taking all of those kind of things. So, yes, he bought them, but he didn't pay much money. There was no money in it. I didn't live off of art. And in terms of the exhibition world, the reality is, yes, I had that first one-man show at a museum when I was about 28 years of age, but I didn't have a gallery show till I was 50. Well, what is that? That's American history. You know, in other words, the civil rights movement, the changes in the society that people fought for. Everybody knows the famous names of people who were a part of that, but the ordinary people who struggled and fought and lived through that and are still fighting and struggling and living through that are the basic essence of where anything creative that I do comes from. And it's as intellectually significant, as emotionally significant, as expressively significant, and contains a reservoir for anything I think anybody could do. And the possibilities are there. As far as a collection like the one represented here, well, this is a kind of collection that a person can do conceptually starting maybe 20 years ago, you know. And I hope that there will be many more collections that develop like this. One of the things I hope that will come from this is real comprehensive retrospectives when people's lives have evolved to the point where that's a significant thing to do. And, you know, so when there's a retrospective of Sam Gilliam, William Williams, you know, and any number of artists who are in this exhibition who I've known through the years, and others who aren't. And the reason for the Norman Lewis piece up there was from a conversation with Norman, because he was my father's generation. And we were having an argument or discussion, whatever you want to call it, and Norman got frustrated. He was about the age I am, so I understand that frustration now. But I was talking too much, and so Norman said, shut up, you fuck, you can't hear with your mouth open. how that translates to the sculpture there is in my interest in kinetic principles is the two parts are separate, and one will rock if you move it, and the other one will not. That one shuts up, if you will.
That's excellent.
So making the translation, if you will, between the ways that human beings express themselves, it's quite possible every day or uniquely with artists.
So I'm going to use that as a segue. Yes, round of applause. Yeah, no, go, fine. Yeah.
Actually, a question for Mel. Back in the mid-90s, there was an article that was written about you, Jack, I guess artists in your generation would have been written by Michael Brinson, right? For the New York Times. You were the cover of that. I remember that.
Yeah.
Yes. And I distinctly remember this because at that time, Carol Walker, Gary Simmons, Glenn, I mean, there were a number of artists who were prominent, black artists who were prominent at that moment. But I remember that the gist of that article was that you guys had not gotten your due, and that there's this power that was that was being ignored. That was the gist of that article. Do you remember this article, Michael Brinson?
Yeah, I probably have a copy of it filed away somewhere. And Michael Brinson is one of the more perceptive people who write about modern art. And from my point of view, one of the very few who understand sculpture thoroughly. You know, his academic interest was Giacometti, who's someone whose work I happen to appreciate. But I like all kinds of sculpture, so it's not limited. But Brinson was the one serious art writer who interviewed people and understood the range of what it was, and probably in part, aside from his own intelligence, is his father was one of the abstract expressionist generation of artists, not one well known, but one who participated well, significantly in it. And for instance, we have Norman Lewis, who was, the pictures there historically, but the information on him is just starting to appear recently, But, I've been, I don't know how to say it. I always wanted to make art. And I don't call it getting my due. It's impossible to give me my due, frankly. And others can speak for themselves in that. But that there's more recognition for the work now, well, that's fine and that's good. But the reason I make art, really, is I like to make art, period. Yeah, okay. You're having trouble hearing me? Sorry. It's just, in the years that I taught at university level for 40, one of the things I think I said that was important was exactly that to students, is that if you're going to try to make art in this world, you had better be sure that you really like to make art. And that's the thing that will carry you the farthest. Not that collectors, not that family, not that, lovers, loved ones, and everybody else don't count. They all count. But you have to have that inside, and that's where it comes from. And as far as the career aspect, well, we didn't even use the word in 1960, and it's common now. People coming out of graduate school expect to possibly have a one-man show in a gallery, and my generation, if you will, thought that artists might have a show when they reached 40, you know, in museum shows. And so my career has been, if you will call it that. Yeah, I had that show because Thomas Levitt, the director of the Santa Barbara Museum, and eventually the head of the American Museum Directors, an artist named Arthur Secunda said, let's take your work and show it to Tom Levitt in Santa Barbara. We went up that weekend, and it was in the period I had just started what amounted to the Lynch fragment, so I took 3 or 4 with me. And I figured he'd pat me on the back and say, nice work, kid, keep it up, you know. And instead he started talking about a one-man show at the museum, which then took place in that following year. Well, works that I developed for that exhibition, like the Lifted X, which on February the 21st, 1965, I was working on for the exhibition, which opened at the end of March. That was the day that Malcolm X was killed. So the work was not made per se for that. In other words, the titles don't come first. The work comes first. But while I was working on it and I got that news, and he was a person whose speeches and, you know, things I paid attention to, and I'd seen him speak once. So I titled the piece, The Lifted X, and developed a part of the piece that have a quasi-X configuration inside of it. You wouldn't know it, but what I'm saying is that piece was made February to March of 1965. It was bought by the Museum of Modern Art in 2014.
Exactly.
So if I wait for them to buy the next one,
That's a really good example of gaps of time. I just want to say how much I appreciate you.
not to interrupt you, but I'm going to get out of it. There's no gap. I kept working all the time, and
Right.
that was the main
Right.
thing.
Yeah,
I kept
sorry.
working all the time, and that was the main thing.
There's no gap in your production or your commitment for sure, but you know, there's lapses and gaps and institutional support of that, right? And I want to just say, add a little bit to that, as far as like what you were saying about getting a due. I don't know what that means either. I guess I'm still defining it. Is there weird feedback in my mic? Okay, it's just here.
Thank you.
I am curious about exhibitions like this in terms of what they can accomplish. You're asking that question. It's really amazing to see these works together intergenerationally. But I wonder what happens when they leave the institution. And if institutionally, the curators, the boards of a museum, perhaps as the Ogden, you know, will continue that sort of interest. You know, maybe give Mel another one-person show, you know, or collect some more of his work so it's not like 2024, you know, so that we have to...
We're doing that, so.
I'm not just talking about you guys, you know, which is awesome that you are.
No, but I know.
There's several shows, you know, concurrently. It's like a cyclical thing, which is great. But it would be great if it wasn't cyclical. You know, it should be the norm. That's how our world is, and that's how we all produce. So I just want to say, like, we all need to get our due together in that sense, right? As patrons and viewers and artists.
I think Chris and I, and there are so many curators here that could easily be the people sitting up front who have a long dedication. They're all over the place, and it's been so great to have everybody here this weekend to making this happen so that this is just the tip of the iceberg that's visible. So when I can only speak for Baltimore, but when the show comes to Baltimore, there will be a whole program of acquisitions around it, and we've already begun that. We are working with Mel to talk about a solo show. We're working with Jack Whitten on a solo show. So, I mean, I think Charles said this yesterday. Pamela and Fred put their money where their mouth is, and there is an extent to which that's really important. You know, that is what makes artists able to continue what you do. So it can't just be the exhibitions. It can't just be the book, Courtney Martin's book, which is sold out and is going to have to be reprinted. It's a whole program, and it's not enough. The history is so problematic that it can't just be these little gestures. It has to be a whole web of activities that work together.
For years.
Yes, yes.
To say something about, it was raised a little bit, but Mel spoke eloquently about the experience of the artists and the personal values of artists and making art and so forth. And often there's a sort of conflict, and this was really sort of more pronounced, I think, that he was suggesting, I think it's true, a conflict between the idea of exhibitions and reputation career and the studio practice, the personal relationship with the work. And often it was thought that one compromised the other, and during the time that I was a young artist, there was a certain suspicion about the issue or the idea of career and how that could sort of compromise your relationship with your work. And and this is true. I mean, that there are two narratives. One has to do with the artist in the studio, and the other, there's that narrative having to do with how that work operates in the public sphere. And I think those two things are independent of each other in a certain way, but equally important. And so, in a way that it's important is that from outside of the control and of the artist, there is this opportunity for art to contribute to public knowledge, for art to help shape the way culture and the world thinks of things. The artist individually has little control over that, because the artist simply can just make the best work that he or she can, and the idea of working in a space that's uncompromised is very important in that respect. But the other narrative having to do with the public sphere is equally important. And as I said, it's outside the control of the artist, and because it operates within the field of curators and writers and collectors, for that matter. And so for that reason, personally, I take that on as sort of that aspect of art that's political. That's an aspect of my experience of art is political, because I get involved in writing and a little curating too, where it's important that those artists who are working privately and individually in their studio, that those artists actually have a voice in the public sphere. And so there's a certain responsibility, therefore, for people who occupy that sphere to pay attention to what's going on in the artist's studio and help to try to advance that voice. That is to say that it's very important that black artists get shown. Personally, I would like to have a show. But as a matter of cultural and social and moral ethic, it's very important that they do get shown, because black people are part of the general public community and should have the same access to whatever benefits there are of being a public person. And so to that respect, I think it really reinforces, it goes back to the contribution of Pam and Fred, and the contribution of this exhibition and these two sort of marvelous curators, that to take on this role to try to argue, try to present, and try to push into the public sphere this activity that artists do. I just want to make the issue clear that although there is a conflict between the personal practice in the studio and the public sphere, it doesn't mean that public sphere is not important and should be forcefully advocated.
So you provided, of course, the perfect segue to my last question, which I'll ask each of you to maybe respond to briefly before opening it up for some questions. So this issue of let's say, a tension between 2 points that may seem difficult to resolve, I think is central to the title of the exhibition, which I understand from talking to a few people might be slightly obscure to some. So solidary and solitary, meaning essentially a sense of togetherness, advocacy, and collective affirmation versus a desire to be alone and to invent and be autographic on one's own, perhaps in the space of the studio. But one thing I've heard coursing through this conversation is a sense of mutual advocacy among artists, and that advocacy reaching back in history and then existing between peers in the present. And so I believe that that's the core of the exhibition upstairs, and I think the reason we gave it that title is to suggest that histories were being written by artists among themselves when those histories weren't being written by historians. So in a certain way, and I'm going to ask maybe Katy to comment first, we didn't really have to curate the exhibition, and we had to have an idea, but a lot of the conversations taking place upstairs were simply conversations that had to be unearthed and made public. So I wanted to talk about that concept of peer relationships and advocacy. Maybe Katy, if you could speak about it just from a curatorial perspective
I'll just
to begin.
say briefly, the title comes from Edouard Glissant, who I know Mel is a fan of, and Jack, and many of the artists in the show, and a friend, and a beautiful writer. And this is a phrase, and I later found it in Elizabeth Catlett's writing as well, and it's the idea that there's a poison choice for Black artists, as there is for Latin American artists, and anyone who's not perceived as being part of the dominant modernist identity, between having a social identity that is representative and being truly free and autonomous and individual. And that is a terrible choice to have to make, and it's one Norman Lewis felt quite strongly. So the ideal, or the idea would be that we're struggling towards some state where we can be both, where Black artists are allowed to both have an identity that is collective and affirmative and chosen, and also to be completely free and individual, the same right that white artists have, to be free, to be light. And so I know Pamela didn't want another Black artist group show, and that's why we changed halfway through, because I realized it was also a generalizing tendency that curators can have sometimes to see Black artists as well, here they are, here's a bunch of Black artists. So I wanted to find the ways that artists themselves had chosen affinities between each other, between the kinds of issues that they were addressing, and in a way that's a different kind of history when people are under threat of social erasure, that there's mutual advocacy, like Chris says, intergenerationally, instead of trying to overcome or negate, like in the traditional modernist history. So that theme of intergenerational connection, especially to Norman Lewis, but then also from younger artists to Mel and to Jack, it was clear that artists were making their own histories, and we're all just catching up. So that's where the show came.
I don't know whether any of the artists have any comment on that concept or not, or we can open it.
I have a comment, I guess. That was very well put. So for me, the idea of oh, thank you. Thanks, Mel. I've never felt the need to choose either or. I know that, there's this, maybe previously, and maybe still, there is this notion that abstraction is devoid of social concerns. Maybe they're not as obvious because they're not depicting them. And I know that, I think Charles had said this before about like an elitism attached to that dance, you say, between the canvas and the chair. But to me, that dance is also part of the struggle. As a woman, as a Black woman, where I come from, all of that emotion and the wave of my body movement is wrapped up in the gesture, the words, the objects, the clothing, the materials that I use. So even though it's not depicting, per se, an event or rally, it is rallying, and it is its own form. I don't know if I'd call it resistance, but it's a definite expression of my politics and my emotions at the same time. And I don't feel that I need to decide between being an artist and producing work in the studio and going out into the world and doing things for my community. So maybe that's a difference generationally. I certainly still feel that there is still some disconnect in the way people approach looking at abstraction, as though it's not black art or above it, or I don't know. There's some really, I can't even describe it because it's so ridiculous. I'm in a show right now in DC of women of color who produced abstraction called Magnetic Fields, and there was a recent review, which was a lovely review and very insightful, but it had the most unfortunate title that is embarrassing. I couldn't even repeat it for a while, but it was something rhyming like, they're women, they're black, and they don't make art about that. And I'm like, where did they get that? That's really crazy. It doesn't make any sense. And right? It's awful. But it was an insightful article, and then I think the person who titles sometimes for media outlets don't write the same article. But, so there's a disconnect between that thinking that made that title and the insightful view of looking at the works and seeing how they relate to each other in the world that I think we need to bridge, maybe through these exhibitions. So anyway, that's my statement on that.
So Leo, since you began, and before we open it out to questions, any closing comments? Not to put you on the spot, but if you want to sum everything up in a couple of sentences, I invite you to.
Boy, I guess actually through it all. Is this on? I was just going to say that actually through it all. The consistency and level of art making, all over. I mean, the art fairs are also been very interesting in terms of how they bridge how we see art and where art comes from, and what kind of art we take serious now. There was a moment when the art fairs didn't exist. It's interesting to sort of note that once that started happening, people started venturing out, meaning collectors started venturing out and collecting art, that was not at home base, actually national base. So to realize the consistent expansion of us as Americans, how we see things, actually through a world lens, not just through an American or national lens. It's very important that happen in order to sort of have this understanding of our artists who are of color who make abstract art. It makes it more exactly far more real when it comes to making digest things holistically on an international level. So
And a market-driven level, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Like value.
I hope I'm making sense, but that's my closing comment.
So, yes, Mel.
I guess I don't feel and haven't felt comfortable in the years that my work has been present in commerce. In other words, had a gallery. The people that have represented me, Clara Sewell, CDS Gallery, and Alexander Gray Gallery, they've been fine as far as the relationship. One of the things I like about this exhibition is some work that's here, which is not, I don't think, a part of the exhibition per se, and that's my dear late friend, the sculptor John Scott. And so to see his work here is personally very moving because we had a lot of conversations, including our last one when he was sitting with a bottle of oxygen in Houston right after Katrina. And he was talking about organizing a drawing show and what it should be about. And I think, that speaks to the continuity that is and the strength of character that exists in some of us that's profound. And in that respect, it's just more important to me. I don't mean that it's not important that the relationships with the public don't expand. I know it's important that they do. But we've got to make and improve work for future, really be focused on the work. I appreciate what writers write about us, complimentary or not. But our job is to make the art. See, they don't have anything to write about. Museums don't have anything to show. Collectors don't have anything to collect. Nobody has nothing if we don't do our part first. And my late wife, the poet Jane Cortez, we would have discussions, about all the arts all the time. And one of the things she said was you have to find your own voice and then you use your own voice and find the next thing that you'll find. The main thing, in other words, is to keep the vitality of your, whatever it takes for you to make work. And I guess I'm always optimistic that things will progress and change. When Katy mentioned Edouard Glissant, well, he's a significant writer. Most people who know him through the French-speaking world, but he's from Martinique, and he bought one of the Lynch fragments in 1984 when there was a quasi-retrospective of my work at UNESCO. And that's way before anybody did something like that here in the United States with the work. John Scott, as I said, he was an example here. We have relationships all over. One aspect, totally out of the loop when we talk about art, because we say the art world, and we're usually talking about the world of art that encompasses primarily Europe and the United States. But two of my, works of that kind are one in the collection of the Oba of Benin. What is that? Well, Benin is a place that's famous for about 1,200 years of bronze casting. And right now, their fight is to get the work that was stolen and taken away with the British expedition in 1897 and returned to Benin. I was just there a month ago to help celebrate the one-year anniversary of the new Oba of Benin. He's aware of what we do in art and modern art because he was a graduate student at Rutgers in the 80s, and we went to hear music and things like that. Now he has the provenance of the continuity of that culture. Our collecting doesn't compare to what they have and continue, and they've been casting bronze on that street since at least 800, the year 800. Okay, there are modern sculptors there. One, Peju Ayiwola, is a sculptor. She's from the royal family. I think she's in residence at the University of Wisconsin now, but she heads the Department of Art at the University in Lagos in Nigeria. There's the sculptor, architect Demas Nwoko there. And through the years, that's been the other set for me of relations. So I'm not sat still here in this world waiting on whatever will happen. It will happen, but we decided many years ago, to go to Mexico. 1 year on the pyramid in Teotihuacan, the next year on the pyramid in Giza, in Cairo. In other words, having a world view, it's nice to have a local view. My mother's born in Louisiana, so Louisiana is not strange to me. You know, the world belongs to us, but we have to get up off our asses and go and deal with it.
That's a pretty terrific ending. So, I think we've run very slightly over, but I want to honor the fact that all of you guys showed up to listen to us speak rather than enjoying the bountiful riches of New Orleans, which is still waiting for you. But if anybody has any couple of questions, I think the panel would be glad to take them. Yeah.
Specifically for Melvin. Your sculpture, one of the things I enjoy most about your sculpture is the purity of the forms. I mean, it's sculpture before it's anything else. The forms don't illustrate anything, they don't pretend to be anything else except what they are. So, in connection with this question about abstraction and social content, is that something you think about in the studio as you work, or is this purity of form something that's just inherent to you? And specifically, pieces like Chain-O and Curtain that are completely abstract works in terms of the form, but they certainly speak heavily in social content.
Well, I never considered that human beings and content were ever inseparable. You know, most people have never been to the dictionary and looked up the word abstract. You know, I bet if I really looked around the room or you look at yourself, you don't have to raise your hand. But most of us have never looked up the word abstract.
Simplify.
You know, and it's quite comprehensive, and I won't give a definition of it. I'll simply say that it's an area of conceptual freedom to do anything, as far as I'm concerned. You know, two examples that most people are familiar with: Jackson Pollock. Most people are familiar with Pablo Picasso. When Picasso's work got to the point that historians usually say he was totally abstract, and then he began to introduce images of the figure or fragments in the work, people said, oh, he's becoming realistic and he's less abstract. They're totally mistaken as far as I'm concerned, because what he really did is he just said, no, everything can be a part of what we use to create a work of art. Everything. Figure, geometry, line, everything could be a part. And that was the work. So those who had the need to label it figurative or abstract were stuck with their needs. But the artist stepped beyond their needs to create his work. Basically a similar thing with Jackson Pollock. When the work had reached a kind of openness, physically and visually, and then when he started to reintroduce images that were recognizable, people said, you know, the work's going there. It wasn't. It's just, he said, everything can be a part of the work. And at this point in history, that's happening anyway. You know, the cell phone is going to ring in a minute and disturb things. You know, and my grandson is going to know so much more about what's on that thing than I do. You know, but there are people who are working with those dynamics and things who will be so sophisticated. Who knows what visual art will be 30 years from now. You know. So, you know, and we came, you know, there was no atomic bomb, you know, until I was 7, 8 years old. And then when I got invited to Japan, I made sure I went to Hiroshima. you know. And I hope nobody ever does that, you know. I just hope nobody ever does that kind of destructive thing. So I would hope that our notion is creative, aesthetic, and, you know, just keeps going that way.
Any other questions? Maybe one or two more? One more. A really good one.
No pressure.
No pressure, Pamela.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for being here and being a part of this exhibition, the curators and the artists, and also the sponsors that made this exhibition possible for the city of New Orleans, and that it's premiering here. It's profound that we can sit here and listen to living artists share their journey and their work intergenerationally, and the idea that you are artists and you create art. I like that I heard that here today, that your art is not black art, it's art. And for the curators to have the opportunity to work with collectors of such a defined collection for a specific historical period of time in the art world. The art world is still surrounded in the area of academia. So my question would be for the curators or any of the artists, how do you see the expansion happening, that this relationship moves in other communities to bring the community, as this triennial is for the community, but to bring the community into this conversation where art opens up a whole world of conversation because it's people and humanity and it's relational. How do you see that expanding more? Because what you've talked about is history, and also in that history for artists are curators of color who are not recognized with the same training as artists, as professionals. And I know as a curator that there are many collections that the world has yet to see that are owned by curators. So how do we change that narrative?
Excellent question.
Just 2 points. I mean, I think one is your operating assumption about who your audience is. And I think this is something we're trying to bear down on the BMA. So one word that occurred earlier in this conversation that occurs repeatedly in our boardroom, and I think in conversations with curators, is if you want to have a relationship with a broad public, actually you have to have an address to that public that is mainstream. That's the word. I mean, to me that means a purely and completely inclusive conversation about elite culture for everyone. And I think there are all sorts of avenues to explore to achieve that goal. But I think the idea has to be to speak in plain language about complex things, so that the range of people who are engaged in that conversation with you is broader than it has been historically. And I think, we've been speaking to each other in the art world for a really long time. And I'm not sure that we've ever challenged that assumption. And I think if it's our mandate as institutions to serve our communities, serve our cities, and I'll speak in the case of Baltimore, to serve Baltimore, you have to speak in a completely different language. I'm always struck, and so just to give it an interesting example, I'm always struck by the question of branding. So if we work with the most interesting, inventive, radical, free thinkers, and I think a word that comes up all the time is freedom, in that space of abstraction, is a space of invention and freedom, why, if we work with these extraordinary creative people, does our brand look like IBM? And why is it that, on that level, why do we elect to look and to project that way? And why wouldn't we elect to speak in language that reflects our core values and that can then be transmitted to a mainstream public? So I think for me, my preoccupation is trying to make an institution that formally elite, preserve that elitism, and make it a mainstream address. I'm not saying I have the solution. If there were a solution, I'd already be doing it. But I think that's the challenge, and I hope it's one that would meet your question.
I'll just say in a really boring, God, I hope this is not the last word, in a really boring way, just like doing the legwork, you know, we should have known about John Scott, and I didn't, and we dug around in the Ogden's warehouse, you know, with Bradley, the curator here, and pulled it out, and then saw how stunning it was, and Pamela bought work by John Scott, and the Baltimore Museum bought work by John Scott, and John Scott will have a much bigger presence at the bigger iteration. So I think partly, you know, local curators, people who have been working, especially with Black artists for decades, they were James Porter, David Driscoll, the Harmon Foundation, these people had the histories and no one went to ask. So it's a really boring thing of doing the legwork and going and asking the people who already know, and I would just say respecting all forms of knowledge and not just the knowledge that happens at elite universities or at MoMA, but happens at regional museums, that happens at historically Black colleges, that happens with collectors and curators who are advocates in a real sort of day-to-day way. And I feel like that there's a sort of way that the global art world, the art fair art world, is not even close to being in touch enough with the texture of art communities in a daily way. And I think that is the really exciting future for me of scholarship.
I don't think it was super boring. I'm content with that being the last word.
It's not boring. It's great to hear that you and Chris are committed to doing more legwork. You know, more curators will be taught that.
And then the Ford Foundation, I would say, and people who are mentoring and giving curators of color, growing from the ground up. You know, people need the support, just like artists need the support, and that's a big piece of it. It's money to give people access.
So I'll say the last word, just to close it out for everyone. I want to say that I think it's a privilege for curators and directors and collectors, everybody involved with the school, to have the chance to think alongside the most important artists thinking and working today. And I think I've often joked that I wouldn't have an intellectual life without art, and most of my friends say you assume you have an intellectual life. But I believe I do, and I know that I owe it to all of you. And it's an honor to do this and to think alongside you. So thank you for coming out, and thank you for doing this for us. Yes.
I wasn't intending to do this, but I just think it's so inspiring. All of you just make our lives so rich. The time we've gotten to spend with all these folks and to appreciate a purity of spirit that I think I've seen in almost no other walks of life is just incredibly inspiring, keeps us going. I hope all of you can feel that, Chris and Katy, to everyone else here, and I just hope you go out and spread the word, not just on this, but in whatever area that you can bring forward new ideas, new conversations, and thank you just all for being here and being part of it, supporting it in whatever way you can, and really thank all of you.
That's great.